The Aeronaut and the Iron Wind. They called him Professor, a showman who sailed the clouds for sport. But in the summer of 1861, as the young American Republic tore itself apart, Thaddeus S. Lowe was preparing for a voyage that would determine the fate of nations. He wasn't just chasing glory. He was about to pilot the very first eye in the sky of a modern war, a mission so audacious it was almost beyond belief. Part 1. The Showman's Audacity. The year 1860 was a carnival of impending doom. While the political air thickened with secessionist fervor, the actual air above the United States was, to a select few, a vast, untapped ocean. Thaddeus Lowe, a self-taught scientist and the nation's premier aeronaut, saw the future not in the iron rails that crisscrossed the continent, but in the silken giants that could transcend them. Born to a poor New Hampshire family, Lowe had the quintessential American hunger for invention and spectacle. He had traveled the world not on a ship, but above it, commanding enormous balloons filled with illuminating gas. His ultimate goal, however, was not just exhibition. It was to prove the utility of aerial navigation for mail, transport, and communication. Lowe's magnum opus was the City of New York, a colossal hydrogen balloon with a capacity of 725,000 cubic feet, the largest man-made flying machine in the world. He dreamed of crossing the Atlantic, a feat deemed lunatic by many and divine by a few. His plans were elaborate, meticulously calculated, involving a compressed gas ballast and a complex navigational system relying on upper air currents. This was not whimsy. This was applied science on a breathtaking scale. In April 1861, Lowe was preparing for a crucial test flight from Cincinnati, Ohio, designed to prove his Atlantic crossing theory. His calculations suggested that he would be borne eastward, over the Appalachians, toward the Atlantic coast. But the winds of fate and the atmosphere had a much crueler path charted for him. Lowe ascended with his assistant and a small, hopeful crowd watching. The ascent was flawless, the initial trajectory promising. But high above the clouds, the predictable easterly flow vanished. Instead, a rogue, powerful wind caught the city of New York, sweeping it not toward the sea, but relentlessly southward, deep into the heart of the burgeoning Confederacy. For 9 terrifying hours, they sailed blind, descending only when necessary, finding themselves dangerously close to the ground near the border of South Carolina. When they finally landed with a jarring thump in a thicket near Unionville, the exhausted aeronauts were immediately surrounded by armed, suspicious men wearing the rough, homespun clothes of the South. Lowe, disheveled and disoriented, was instantly taken captive. His foreign-sounding scientific jargon and the immense crumpled silk balloon were enough to condemn him as a Union spy. It was only the chance appearance of a local professor who had read about Lowe's famous balloon exploits in a northern newspaper that saved him from a likely execution. Released, but shaken, Lowe finally grasped the gravity of the national schism. The sky he had sought to conquer for humanity was now a war zone, and his remarkable invention, the balloon, was an instrument of immediate, terrifying suspicion. He returned north, not defeated, but galvanized. He knew with absolute certainty that if the South could view his balloon as an espionage device, so could the North. The race was on, not for the Atlantic, but for the ear of President Abraham Lincoln. Part 2. The Presidential Audience. Lowe was not the only balloonist to see the military potential of the gas-filled giants. John Lamountain had already offered his services to General Benjamin Monroe at Fortress Monroe, using a balloon named Fanny to successfully spot Confederate positions. However, Lamountain was a maverick, prone to impulsive actions and unwilling to submit to military discipline. He was a brilliant sailor of the air, but a terrible soldier. Lowe, by contrast, was an organizer, a planner, and a relentless self-promoter. He arrived in Washington, D.C., a city paralyzed by indecision and reeling from the humiliating defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. The Union Army, scattered and demoralized, desperately needed an edge, a new way to pierce the impenetrable screens of the Confederate forces led by the wily General Robert E. Lee. Lowe's initial pitch to the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, was ambitious. He proposed a balloon corps, a fleet of interconnected telegraph-equipped airships that could provide real-time reconnaissance and artillery spotting. Chase, impressed by Lowe's meticulous plans and his sheer conviction, arranged an audience with President Lincoln. On June 17, 1861, on the lawns of the Smithsonian Institution, the future of military aviation was launched. Lowe ascended in his balloon, the Enterprise, rising hundreds of feet directly over the Capitol. The ground was instantly transformed into a giant tactical map. Inside the basket, Lowe carried a telegraph key and a line that trailed back to the ground, where Lincoln, Chase, and a nervous group of cabinet members stood waiting. Lowe, looking down at the miniature figures, began tapping out a message, a demonstration of the real-time communication that was the key to his entire proposal. The message, delivered to Lincoln's hand, was simple and profound. To President, United States, Sir. This point of observation commands an extent of country nearly 50 miles in diameter. I have pleasure in sending you this first dispatch ever telegraphed from an aerial station, and in acknowledging my indebtedness to your encouragement for the opportunity to demonstrate the practical value of the science. Thaddeus Lowe. Lincoln, the practical lawyer and visionary statesman, was instantly converted. The president recognized not just a scientific novelty, but a strategic imperative. The ability to see over the next hill, to know the enemy's numbers and movements before the attack, was revolutionary. It was the end of the fog of war as generals had known it for centuries. With a presidential order, and despite the deep skepticism of General Scott, the aging tradition-bound commander-in-chief, Lowe was appointed chief aeronaut of the Union Army. His civilian title, Professor, stuck, but his mission was now military, his laboratory the battlefields of Virginia. He was granted the unprecedented rank of colonel and a budget that dwarfed many other military projects. The great American balloon race was over. Thaddeus S. Lowe had won the right to wage war from the sky. Part 3. The Birth of the Balloon Corps. Lowe immediately began building his aerial fleet. He needed balloons that were easily transportable, quickly inflated, and robust enough to withstand field conditions. He commissioned 6 custom-built balloons, all smaller than the colossal city of New York, yet still impressive. The Eagle, the Constitution, the Washington, the Fulton, the Excelsior, and the most famous of all, the Intrepid. The Intrepid was a marvel of engineering. It was specifically designed to be inflated rapidly from 2 separate gas generators that were mounted on wheeled wagons, a mobile hydrogen production unit, a genuine logistical nightmare that Lowe mastered. The entire operation was a precursor to modern field maintenance and logistics. The camp, a bustling, bizarre mixture of military austerity and fairground logistics, became a source of constant fascination and ridicule among the regular infantry. The first true test came during the Peninsular Campaign, as General George McClellan's massive Army of the Potomac slowly advanced on the Confederate capital of Richmond. McClellan, famously cautious and obsessed with knowing the precise strength of his enemy, quickly became Lowe's biggest champion. Lowe's headquarters was often a mile or 2 behind the front lines. The routine was set. The huge, swaying balloon would be partially inflated on the ground. A team of 20 to 30 men would then haul the massive, varnished silk envelope and its intricate network of ropes and pulleys to a suitable launching site, usually an open field. The final hydrogen inflation would begin, a process that could take several hours, constantly monitored for leaks or catastrophic explosion. The ascent itself was a breathtaking spectacle. Lowe or one of his hand-picked aeronauts would clamber into the fragile wicker basket, carrying with them a telescope, a notebook, and the all-important telegraph key. The cable, which served as both the tether and the communication line, was unwound from a massive reel attached to a horse-drawn wagon. From his vantage point, often at heights of 1,000 feet or more, Lowe could see for 20, 30, even 40 miles. He could count Confederate tents, estimate troop strength by the number of campfires,